This chapter is on corporate governance, and it's a non-quantitative chapter, and so it's pretty easy. So this is going to be a relatively short presentation. But the two big things that we're going to talk about in this chapter are agency conflicts, which arise in the corporate form of organization, and corporate governance, which are structures that are set up to try and alleviate the agency costs. So an agency relationship happens whenever someone hires someone else to work for them, basically. So the principal hires another individual called the agent to perform some service, and they delegate decision-making authority to that agent. And so the problem comes up if the agent does not make the decision that the principal would make if they were in that position. So if there's any suboptimal behavior going on, that's called an agency cost. So owner managers versus outside shareholders. So if you are a small business owner, so you own your own business, you are the owner and the manager, there's no such thing as agency costs, right? Because you're making all the decisions and whatever you do is right for you. So if you're an owner manager, you can do all this stuff, and you've seen people that do this, that they spend money on luxurious offices, expense accounts, they charge everything to the business, country club memberships. That's fine if you own the business. You can spend your money however you want. But if you don't own the business, then outside shareholders are bearing the cost of those managers' perks. And so in the owner managed business, the owner bears the cost of those perks. In the stockholder form of organization, the stockholders are bearing the majority of the cost, and the owner managers are reaping the majority of the benefits. And so in this form of organization, so the corporate form of organization, minority shareholders are going to pay less for a share of stock because this agency cost reduces the value of the stock to them. Now, another agency cost arises with borrowers and lenders. So when a company borrows money, the lender assesses the risk of the company, and the risk is reflected in the interest rate that's charged on the loan. And so the agency cost here is that the company can get the money from the loan, and then they can turn around it and invest it in riskier projects than they have in the past. So in other words, if the lender knew what they were going to do, they would have charged them a higher interest rate for the higher risk. But the lender didn't know, and so the company got the money at too low of a cost. And so who benefits most if there's a small, medium, and big payoff? Well, if there's a big payoff, then the company benefits, right? And the lender is still getting the same rate of interest. So who loses most if there's a small, medium, and big loss? Well, it depends how big the loss is. But so if the loss is big enough that the lender doesn't get paid back, then they lose, obviously. And maybe the manager that made the decision gets fired, maybe they don't. So one way to increase the risk to lenders is to invest in risky projects. Another way is to take on additional debt. And so if the second amount of debt is not subservient to the first, then that increases the risk to the original lender. And so both of those are agency costs of debt. So creditors, anticipating possible harmful actions, will charge a higher interest rate than otherwise would seem to be warranted. That causes the company's cost of capital go up, and you know from discounting future cash flows, if the cost of capital goes up, the value of the company goes down. So that's an agency cost of debt. The higher, in addition to the suboptimal decisions, the higher interest rate that was charged by the bank in anticipation of suboptimal behavior. So how can we reduce the agency costs of debt? So one way is to secure the loan with company assets, okay, like a mortgage. So you have a building that's security for a loan. That's one way to make the lender more secure. Another way is to place restrictive covenants on the borrower. And so these would be things like maintaining profitability ratios, not borrowing any more money, retained earnings at a certain level, restrictions on dividend payouts, and no more issuing of debt. So it's restrictions that are placed on the company, and those too are agency costs. Those are agency costs of debt. So in the companies today, there are many shareholders, and none of them typically own a controlling interest in the company. So the ownership is widely dispersed. And so all of these dispersed shareholders delegate decision-making authority to the board of directors, and the board of directors in turn delegates most of the decision-making authority to management. who then hire other employees. And so you're getting farther and farther and farther from the owners and the people that are making decisions, right? And so the potential agency conflict between shareholders and managers gets bigger the more complex the organization. So this says 6, but I added 1 because there's another slide. So 6 potential problems with managerial behavior. One is they expend too little time and effort. So they don't work as hard as if the shareholders truly own the company that they would work themselves or would want management to work. Consume too many perks, the expensive office, all the trappings of power, the country club, the plane, whatever. Sometimes managers will avoid difficult decisions because of loyalty to friends and companies. It's not what you think of when you think about modern corporations, but it's a possibility. And this is the one that I added, that they focus on their own power and prestige. And this is a very common problem in corporate America, is that the CEO types want to own the more. They want to be in charge of more. And so they're focused on their own power and prestige, and they make acquisitions that are not positive net present value acquisitions. They're not going to increase the value of the company. So more bad behavior. They reject risky positive net present value projects to avoid looking bad if the project fails. Or the flip side, they take on risky negative net present value projects to try and hit a home run. So in the first one, they're rejecting risky projects that might turn out to be good because they're worried about the failure. And in the second one, they're taking on risky projects that have negative net present value, meaning they're not good projects, but on the 10% chance that it turns out good, it would be a home run and they would look like a real winner. And so you can have both kinds of bad decisions made. A big one is avoid returning capital to investors. When we talk about free cash flow is the money left over after everything that the company needs to spend money on. And so by rights, that money should be paid out to the stockholders, right? Because the company has used it for whatever they needed it for. And so free cash flow should be synonymous with dividends, but it's not. Companies typically hang on to that cash, and this is especially true right now. Companies are hanging on to piles of cash for whatever. Maybe looking for companies to buy. Mergers and acquisitions are going crazy right now. And so are those good positive net present value investments is another question. Another problem is that managers will massage information and manage earnings announcements to avoid revealing bad news. Think Enron. So corporate governance is the set of rules and procedures that tries to make managers behave, basically. And so there's the carrot and the stick method of doing it. And so this is where finance comes in. I find this topic to be just fascinating. How do you compensate people so that they behave like you want them to do? And so that's why you typically think of corporate governance and managerial behavior as more of an HR or a management thing. The compensation thing is definitely a finance thing. So corporate governance provisions under a firm's control. So the board of directors, in theory, the board of directors, is supposed to watch what the company is doing. We'll talk a little bit more about that after we go through this. So charter provisions affecting takeovers, i.e. preventing them, compensation plans, how the company is financed can actually have an impact on managerial decision making, and then internal accounting control systems. So these are all things that are under a firm's control, types of corporate governance to try and get management to behave. So an effective board of directors would not have staggered boards where just a few of them come up every year. It makes it difficult for minorities to gain seats on the board, and so all members are elected each year, not just with multi-year staggered terms. And board elections allow cumulative voting. Okay, so you can read more about this in the book, in the chapter. It's easy to understand. But a big one here is that the CEO is not the chairman of the board. So if you think about board meetings and who sets the agendas, the chairman of the board is supposed to set the agendas. Now, admittedly, the chairman of the board and the CEO typically work in great tandem, but the CEO controls a lot of information, and so we definitely don't want the CEO to be the chairman of the board, and we don't want them to have undue influence over the board. Um, to control the flow of information and to try and get at information that is being suppressed. So another feature of an effective board is that a majority of the directors are outsiders and with business expertise. You would be amazed how often this is not true. So you look at corporate boards and it's like, what does that person know about this business? And the answer is most often nothing. They're somebody, another CEO in the local community that got put on this board. So this is really important that you have outsiders that know something about the business. I just read recently that Boeing was putting new people on their board of directors because of all the problems they're having with their little MAX jets. And these people actually have expertise in airlines. And so that was something novel. So here's the problem. Effective boards do not have interlocking boards, meaning the CEO of A sits on B's board and B sits on A board. Really common problem, because if you're interlocking boards, how likely are you to rock the boat and say, I don't think you guys are doing the right thing over here? You're not, because board compensation is very lucrative and board members don't want to risk getting fired from the board because it's a cozy arrangement. And so another, board members are not unduly busy. Okay, most people that sit on boards are CEOs of companies. So do you think that they're really not unduly busy? Do they really have time to be an effective monitor of the company on whose board they're sitting? Probably not. So you don't want compensation so high that it encourages cronyism, or in other words, it's so high that I don't want to lose my board seat, so I'm not going to raise any red flags about anything that's going on. And then not all compensation is a fixed salary. Some is linked to the firm performance. So other things that firms can do, and you can read about these in the chapter: targeted share repurchases, poison pills, restricted voting rights. Those are all anti-takeover provisions. So those are in the charter and they're to prevent a takeover. Well, a takeover is the ultimate enforcer in the marketplace, right? If a company is destroying enough value, then they become a takeover target. And so that is the ultimate enforcer of good managerial behavior. You'll be taken over and kicked out if you're doing a bad job. And so anti-takeover provisions in the corporate charter are against that. They're preventing the market from working. So stock options and compensation plans. Okay, so we can give managers shares of stock, we can give them stock options, we can tie their compensation to earnings, we can do all kinds of things. So all of these things sound good in theory, but in practice, managers find ways around the intent. So stock options give the owner of the option the right to buy stock at a specified price called the strike price in the future. So typically you get options and they're exercisable in 5 years, and that's called the vesting period. And so typically the exercise price would be set above the stock price at the time of the grant of the options. And so obviously the idea is that the ability to buy a stock at the strike price that's set above the market price isn't valuable, right? And so this option doesn't become valuable until the stock price goes above the strike price. So the idea is managers will be motivated to take action to make the stock price go up, because then they personally will benefit. Okay, so can't exercise the option after a certain number of years, so the options expire. So there's some window in which you can exercise the options. So now here are the problems with stock options. Number one, the majority of a stock price's movement is dependent on the market, not what's happening in the company at all. And this goes both directions. So a manager can underperform the market or their peer group, but if the stock market is going up and dragging their stock along with it, then their option becomes valuable and it doesn't have anything to do with what they're doing in the company. And then sometimes, think Enron again, it encourages managers to falsify financial statements or take excessive risks to make the stock price go up in reaction to an announcement, so that their option becomes valuable and they can exercise the option, and then the market finds out that it was all a lie. So the fact is, options sound good, but in practice, they are far too connected to market. And the same thing goes true. If the market is going into a recession, the stock price is going to go down, and that's not management's fault, just like going up in a bull market is not management's fault. And so basically, tying compensation to the stock market is not a good policy, whether it's through shares of stock or through stock options, because managers cannot control the price of the stock that directly. So, block ownership is a pretty effective policer of management behavior. We have big institutional investors like CalPERS, the California Public Employees Retirement System, and TIAA-CREF, which is the retirement system for university faculty. Those are both big, huge institutional investors who are also very savvy. And so they monitor the companies that they own stock in. And if the company is not maximizing shareholder wealth, then they're going to put pressure on management to do something differently. So this is an effective deterrent to bad behavior, but they don't own stock in every company out there. And so finally, regulatory systems and laws. In the United States, we have fairly strong protections provided by the SEC and the accounting system. And so what that does, the purpose of all of that is to make sure that information that goes out to shareholders is transparent and truthful. And if the information is transparent and truthful, companies will have better access to capital, the cost of equity will be lower, market liquidity is increased, and stock prices are a better reflection of what true value is. And all of that is good for society and good for wealth creation. So again, agency costs are an inherent cost of the corporate form of organization. And so corporate governance is all about how do we minimize agency costs and increase value.